As dawn broke over the muddy fields of Belgium in May 1940, the German forces, buoyed by their previous successes in Poland and the swift conquest of the Low Countries, expected another blitzkrieg, a lightning-fast military operation designed to outmaneuver and destroy enemy forces before they could effectively respond. The Wehrmacht had meticulously planned a rapid advance through the Ardennes, utilizing their well-coordinated divisions to localize the combat radius of their armored units and mechanized infantry. Tanks, aircraft, and motorized troops were to converge swiftly, breaching the French lines and flanking Allied positions. The operational premise was contingent not only on speed, but also on the element of surprise, achieving a breakthrough that would effectively outpace Allied reinforcements. However, unbeknownst to the German High Command, they were about to face a formidable adversary, not merely in the form of Allied troops, but in the very terrain across which they were to advance. The muddy soil, drenched by weeks of rain, conspired to undermine the Wehrmacht's tactical advantage. When the panzers rolled into Belgium, they quickly found themselves bogged down in wetlands that turned fierce armored columns into languid and vulnerable targets. The promising offensive plan devolved into a desperate struggle against the natural landscape itself. As tracks sank into the clay-like earth, German troops scaled back their expectations of an overwhelming display of mechanized might. Artillery units, designed to provide support for fast-moving ground forces, began to face logistical challenges dictated by the climate, with shells becoming partially dislodged and less efficient on a surface softening under the unrelenting moisture. Maintenance crews who were accustomed to conducting repairs at breakneck speed found themselves hampered by the conditions, their tools muddied, and the availability of spare parts reduced to an ethereal hope. In contrast, the Allied forces, comprised of British Expeditionary Forces, BEF, and French troops, scrambled to mount a defensive posture against the rapidly advancing German onslaught. The response was encapsulated in the order for the construction of an improvised defense, effectively a hastily wrought series of fortified positions along the key roads and waterways leading to Brussels. Understanding the challenges posed by the extensive Belgian terrain, they sought to exploit the mud as a tactical ally rather than a hindrance. Sandbags were filled with earth and positioned alongside vital clearances, utilizing not only the natural ambush sites, but also the sheer unpredictability of conditions to protect men and machinery from becoming overwhelmed. Despite this, the human element of war cannot be downplayed in the face of technological development and logistical necessities. As the German advancements stalled in the mud, panic began to spread amongst their ranks. Soldiers who were once filled with a sense of invincibility faced the harsh realization that their impressive war machine had become an enormous and cumbersome liability. The machine gun emplacements from Allied positions began to take advantage of the immobilized panzers, raining down bullets in rapid-fire volleys, while artillery units took position on high ground overlooking immobile tanks, pinpointing them with devastating accuracy. The men behind the lines witnessed a grim spectacle. German soldiers, initially so confident in their blitzkrieg strategy, were now reduced to frantic measures, pedaling through the muck or attempting to salvage their equipment from the mire. Among the troops, angst morphed into anger as they grappled with a situation seemingly beyond their control. Commanders debated strategies, some advocating for a tactical withdrawal to regroup and reinforce, while others clung to the remnants of their original plan, believing a counteroffensive could still prevail. Tension permeated the German ranks, stretching morale thin as the realization dawned that what had been expected as a series of operational victories would likely metamorphose into a campaign of attrition. Each decision weighed heavily on the shoulders of commanders who were forced to confront the grim truth that their units, once a cohesive embodiment of military agility, now relied as much on their wit and ingenuity as on their hardware. Confronted with their own tactical considerations, the Allied command sought to consolidate their position while ramping up their own logistical efforts. Supplies were prioritized, utilizing the waterways of Belgium for transportation, where mud would prove less impactful than the overland routes that had hampered the Germans. The port of Antwerp became a crucial hub as Allied commanders executed supply chain logistics with precision, driving trucks laden with equipment through comparative stability. They understood that a chaotic environment could be exploited, leading to a continuous resupply and allowing for the reinforcement of frontline positions, bolstering the morale of troops ready to meet their foes. In the infantry trenches and defensive positions, there existed an unyielding desire to survive, an instinct that propelled soldiers to adapt under pressure. Foot soldiers, cautious and aware, dug deeper into their positions, emergency rations held tightly in hand, sharing small stories to lighten the grim atmosphere, while keeping vigilant watch on the muddied battlefield that lay ahead. These moments of levity did not erase the fear that gripped their hearts, but acted as bastions against despair, reminding them of the lives they were fighting for beyond the distant chaos. As night fell, a dull rhythm built upon their greatest strength, a unified sense of resilience, proving that even in war's darkest pits, there remains a flicker of hope. As the days stretched into relentless combat, both sides faced the gut-wrenching emotional burden that accompanies prolonged conflict. The losses began to mount, and the faces of fallen comrades served as a haunting reminder of war's unforgiving nature. For the German forces, the realization of their vulnerability in the depths of mud illuminated their early confidence with a harsher lens, leading to skepticism among the rank and file about their command's decisions. The realities of combat soon surpassed the calculated strategies of both sides, each step taken only to face the consequences of previous missteps. Attrition, not glory, marked the confrontation as soldiers on both fronts grappled not only with the enemy's advance, but also the ever-looming chaos instigated by an unforgiving landscape. The saturating mud, once seen merely as an obstacle to be overcome, transformed into a powerful protagonist in this theater of war, a reminder that often, in the theater of battle, nature itself holds the cards. In the midst of Europe's relentless winter of 1940-41, the Belgian landscape transformed into a treacherous quagmire, an environment that dramatically impacted military operations. The German Wehrmacht, known for its blitzkrieg tactics and rapid armored advances, found its audacious expectation of a swift victory in Belgium thwarted by a significant increase in rainfall, which resulted in a thick layer of mud enveloping the terrain. This muck not only inhibited their tanks' maneuverability, but also encumbered supply lines critical for sustaining the fast-paced operations that their doctrine relied upon. As the panzer divisions rolled into Belgium, the carefully laid plans of their commanders soon unraveled in the face of natural elements that turned their state-of-the-art tanks into mere immobilized targets, subjected to the very conditions that they had underestimated. The initial phases of the German invasion relied heavily on the Luftwaffe's air superiority, designed to obliterate enemy positions and supply depots ahead of ground assaults. Yet, as daylight gave way to an inescapable dampness, the Luftwaffe's capabilities waned. Aircraft struggled to maintain operational altitude due to low visibility caused by heavy fog and rain. Bombing runs, which were supposed to devastate Belgian defenses, often missed their marks, while anti-aircraft fire became increasingly effective as ground-based units adjusted to the unpredictable combat environment. With the trees lining the manageable roads reduced to mere shadows, ground troops were left to face the full brunt of the mud's impact, dealing blows not just to logistics, but also to morale. As the Wehrmacht's mechanized forces bogged down in Belgium's sodden fields, the Allied response began to crystallize. Belgian forces, bolstered by French and British troops, took a stand, leveraging the adverse conditions to their advantage. They engaged in defensive maneuvers that, while still constrained by their own limitations in mobility, aimed to exploit the Germans' precarious situation. Reinforcing positions became a matter of urgency, as Allied commanders recognized that the mud rendered traditional offensive strategies impractical. Artillery positions were hastily established on elevated ground, allowing for better fields of fire, while simultaneously creating barriers to impeding enemy approaches. The rigorous shelling, originating from entrenched positions, disrupted German supply columns and created a psychological barrier, stopping the German advances in their tracks. Here, the battle turned from the momentum of rapid warfare to a grind of attrition, where courage in the trenches and tactical ingenuity by the defenders slowly undermined what was once the German juggernaut's advance. As days turned into weeks, the realities of a war of positions began to sink in. Chain of command noted a marked shift in the nature of warfare as trench lines became a focal point, reminiscent of World War I, rather than the expected quick engagements they had trained for. Supplies stretched thin as fuel, and ammunition trucks found themselves ensnared in mud, their wheels sinking deep into the earth, awaiting rescue while supplies dwindled. The German soldiers, far removed from the romanticized images of swift conquests broadcasted by the Nazi propaganda machine, were witness to the grim reality of trench warfare: disease, hunger, and the grim-faced choice of either advancing on stagnant lines or immobilizing themselves in an inhospitable landscape. Cold mud clung to their boots, each soldier encumbered by the weight of their gear and the extraordinary battlefield conditions, moments of doubt flickering among them as commanders continued relaying orders from behind the front lines, where the consequences of their detached decisions began to affect morale. The human cost of these prolonged engagements weighed heavily on both sides. For every advancement made by the Wehrmacht, there were harrowing sacrifices. The laughter and stories shared in the dark of night replaced by hushed tones of fear and uncertainty. Soldiers found solace in camaraderie, sharing their scant rations, but with every shift in the damp earth, the ground claimed its due. Casualties mounted, leading to grief that cloaked the battlefield like fog. The faces of comrades in arms became ghostly apparitions, haunting the ever-weary soldiers as they inadvertently filled their ranks with replacements. Young men often untested and unprepared for the brutal reality of war. These replacements were thrust into a quagmire of destruction, with the stark realization that valor in this landscape bore grim consequences. Meanwhile, planning at the command levels oscillated. German leaders debated the efficacy of offensive operations and the need to regroup and reorganize. Supplies ran low, and with winter's grasp tightening around the troops, it became increasingly apparent that the blitzkrieg was not sustainable in such fortuitous conditions. German General Erich von Manstein, advocating for a more patient, methodical approach, called for halting offensive actions in favor of consolidating their forces, while others insisted that the drive to victory must continue, even as soldiers' spirits waned in the mire. The rift among commanders indicated that the Wehrmacht's initial confidence was fraying, and the scene was set for complex decisions that would influence the war's progression. In the depths of this muddied battlefield, the psychological toll weighed heavily on all soldiers. That constant tension loomed large, not just the anxiety of advancing against an enemy, but also the fear of what awaited them in the unforgiving landscape. Tales of horror spread through the ranks, adding to the dread that pushed men to the brink of despair. Troops became increasingly aware of their environment's capricious nature, where a momentary lapse could spell grim consequences in an unforgiving expanse, where artillery rounds landed indiscriminately amongst friends and foes alike. The strain of such an environment led to mutual friction within companies, as shared isolation bordered tensions among comrades, challenging the very core of unit cohesion that was so critical in warfare. As the conflict's movement stagnated, it became clear that in this war, it was the elements, the mud, the weather, and the psychological burden, held more sway than the tactical brilliance of any military commander. The muddy battleground became an adversary in its own right, a treacherous living entity that demanded respect and adaptability. Soldiers experienced firsthand that nature, indifferent to ambitions for glory, could render the most sophisticated machinery obsolete. In their struggle to regain control, the beleaguered armies found themselves at a reckoning that complexity in war transcends mere military strategy. It reflects the tenuous existence and indomitable spirit of humanity amidst chaos. As they battled against each other, they simultaneously grappled with the primal forces of nature, a reminder that, despite the might of engineered machines and war strategies, the landscape could turn even the most formidable into mere specters of defeat. The challenges faced in both maneuvers and human resilience remain relevant in the discussions of modern warfare, illustrating the fundamental truth that sometimes the fiercest battles are not fought against an enemy, but against the very earth underneath one's feet. As the war dragged on, lessons learned among the mud-logged fields of Belgium would resonate throughout history, and those recent experiences echo in present times, reminding us to look deeper into the narratives of war, especially at what costs victory shines through. As we reflect on these stories, we invite you to engage further. Subscribe for more insights into the tales of war, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Each battle tells a story, and your voice contributes to the understanding of humanity's storied and tumultuous past. As the German forces mobilized their armored divisions with the anticipation of a swift and decisive breakthrough through Belgium in the autumn of 1944, they were initially buoyed by the lessons learned during previous campaigns. Tanks like the Panzer IV and the more advanced Panther were deployed, the former designed for speed and maneuverability, while the latter boasted superior armor and firepower. The strategists behind the German Wehrmacht anticipated a mechanized blitzkrieg that would facilitate a quick encirclement of Allied forces and a path towards victory. However, what lay ahead was the unrelenting churn of Belgium's terrain, which would turn this hope into a logistical nightmare and a testament to human endurance amidst hardship. The mud of the fields and roads soon became as formidable a foe as any entrenched soldier. After heavy rains, the soil transformed into a viscous quagmire that swallowed vehicles whole. It bogged down not only tanks, but also supply convoys, artillery units, and the infantry that were meant to support the armored thrust. Mechanical failures increased as engines overheated under the strain of pulling heavy equipment through the sticky muck. In what was anticipated to be a rapid parade of advanced military might, the German armored divisions became mired and immobilized, their once streamlined offensive reduced to a series of stalled behemoths sitting helplessly amidst pools of mud. Commanders on both sides were forced to adapt their tactics in response to the unique challenges posed by the landscape. The Germans sought to maintain the momentum of their operations despite these setbacks. They utilized their air superiority to conduct reconnaissance and precise bombardments aimed at disrupting Allied supply lines, hoping that the further degradation of logistical support would compensate for their own troubles in maneuvering. However, the Allied forces, buoyed by a persistent commitment to hold their positions, began to dig in, constructing fortified positions that included makeshift bunkers and anti-tank defenses. The terrain, once deemed a simple obstacle, transformed into a labyrinthine network of trenches and strongholds, thus slowing the German advance into a protracted, grinding engagement. Strategy calls in warfare often become fluid, morphing and shifting in relation to unfolding circumstances. The German command witnessed their chance for a rapid victory dissipate amidst the mud, realizing that their logistical tail was struggling to keep pace with the advancing spearhead. Heavy equipment became stranded, and fuel shortages emerged. The muddy conditions rendered sophisticated armor and tactics ineffective, compelling German leaders to rely on entrenched infantry tactics, more reminiscent of World War I than the modern warfare with which they were accustomed. Coordination between the Army and Luftwaffe became increasingly crucial, yet the formidable elements of nature worked against the seamless execution expected by military hierarchy. Simultaneously, the human dimension of this conflict took on stark and tragic forms. Soldiers, battered by the psychological toll of combat, found themselves struggling not just against enemy combatants, but against the very earth itself. Many reported overwhelming feelings of helplessness as they waded through the mire, their physical fortitude tested by the unyielding conditions. This was a harsh reminder of the vulnerability of the human spirit in the face of unrelenting nature. Mud would cling to their uniforms, denoting not only physical struggle but also psychological burdens that weighed invisibly heavy upon their resolve. Instances of frostbite and illness spiked as the men remained exposed to relentless weather, compounded by the depressing realities of their situation. The fleeting hope of a breakthrough morphed into an overwhelming struggle for survival, reducing their mission to an existential fight rather than the pursuit of glory. In stark contrast, the Allied forces began capitalizing on intelligence gathered from reconnaissance flights and captured enemy documents, taking advantage of the evolving German predicament. They orchestrated counter-offensives that targeted the increasingly vulnerable German armor. With tanks immobilized or rendered ineffective, the Allies began deploying anti-tank weaponry more efficiently, placing dedicated infantry units equipped with Panzerfausts and other anti-tank systems in positions that commanded visibility over the muddy fields. These tactics, coupled with coordinated artillery barrages, inflicted heavy casualties on German tank crews and forced many units to retreat, mired not only in mud but in mounting despair as their losses mounted. The clash of wills and the undeniable tragedy of war unfolded in stagnant fields. Incidents of panic arose amid the chaos, with nervous soldiers succumbing to the suffocating weight of mud, both physical and metaphorical, illustrating both the fear of confrontation and the toll on morale that can erode even the best-formed units. As fervent skirmishes played out across sodden expanses, the soldiers faced the fragility of life molded by fire, fear, and muddy decay. Reports of entire platoons becoming encircled or struck by artillery fire were met with desperation, illustrating the often invisible barriers of guidance and communication that can fracture unit cohesion. The ongoing offensive melted from dynamic maneuvers into drawn-out exchanges of artillery and small unit actions amidst the mud. Days turned into weeks, each moment spent fighting against not only the opposing forces, but also the environment itself, provoking reflections that bore down on frontline soldiers. The interplay of fate, will, and the unyielding forces of nature blended into a surreal tableau of warfare. The resilience displayed by the Allies amidst adversity shone as a salient point of departure toward future engagements, demonstrating the capacity to adapt in dire circumstances. Ultimately, the muddy battleground of Belgium became a crucible, where strategy met the harsh realm of reality. Faded aspirations of quick victories transformed into lessons learned through the interactive dance of combat and nature, highlighting enduring truths about warfare that would ring true across future generations. A struggle marked by unflagging determination. The theater of war shifted as the realization of environmental challenges influenced the trajectory of military campaigns. Thus, the very earth, in its muddy embrace, echoed the timeless narrative of conflict. The resilience of humanity tested, and shattered hopes rebuilt amidst the rubble of dreams thwarted. In the end, the unfolding of events in Belgium not only altered the course of the immediate conflict, but shaped perceptions of warfare altogether. As history examined these muddy battles, the significance of nature within warfare would persistently remain a focal point in understanding military operations, an evocative reminder of how victory can be influenced by factors far beyond mere firepower and tactics. The echoes of these lessons resonate until today, a compelling narrative that weaves together the stark realities of conflict against the background of nature's sublime indifference. As the cold grip of Belgian winter stretched onwards, the operational timeline envisioned by the German High Command began to unravel spectacularly. The Blitzkrieg strategy, predicated on speed, surprise, and the rapid coordination of mechanized forces, had initially taken the Allies by surprise. German tanks, the Panzer divisions, were designed as the spearhead of this strategy, designed to exploit weak points and envelopment tactics to encircle enemy forces swiftly. However, the relentless Belgian rainfall that descended upon the countryside subverted these plans, turning open fields into quagmires, disengaging armored units from the crucial momentum they so desperately sought. Mud, that insidious enemy, rendered mighty panzers stagnant and transformed them into mere targets awaiting Allied artillery. An overwhelming sense of frustration permeated German command as the once promising campaign descended into a frustrating stalemate, forcing commanders to adapt rapidly to an environment that was ill-suited for their proposed maneuvers. The logistical dilemmas facing German forces only compounded the situation. Supply lines, reliant on transportation networks that were now bedraggled and unreliable, struggled to keep pace with the fluid requirements of a mobile mechanized army. Fuel shortages loomed ominously as tanker trucks sank to their axles, forced to navigate a landscape turned hostile and treacherous. The tactical response to these setbacks took on a dual focus, reinforcing existing positions while simultaneously attempting to launch localized counteroffensives. It was a desperate attempt to regain the initiative by using infantry and support units to compensate for stalled armor. The Allies, increasingly emboldened by the misfortunes of their adversaries, capitalized on the German vulnerability, utilizing local terrain to their advantage through both defensive and offensive maneuvers. British and American units dug in, creating strong points in areas with better drainage and strategically elevated positions to counter the lurking panzers. Their artillery units became crucial actors in this fray, as their heavy guns exploited the mud-laden German formations, targeting concentrations of immobilized armor with precise artillery barrages. These engagements were marked by the accuracy of ordnance striking at the heart of what had been perceived as invulnerable machinery of war. It underscored how the concepts of operational superiority were now being undermined by the unforgiving realities of frontline conditions. As the days turned into weeks, the human element of warfare unfolded dramatically against this backdrop of conflict. Soldiers on both sides confronted the psychological toll of living through relentless rain, mud, and the constant fear of attack. The sensory experience became an inseparable part of combat, the roar of engines now followed by a resonant silence, as tanks settled in the mire, and the acrid scent of burnt oil mingled unpleasantly with the foul stench of stagnant water accumulating in hastily dug foxholes. The mud was inescapable, clinging to uniforms, weapons, and spirits. Allied units began to employ unconventional tactics of limited local counteroffensives, using infantry to attack the vulnerable panzers or laying ambushes designed to lure German forces into entrapment. The mud dictated the pace of warfare. Slow engagements became commonplace, and small unit actions over time evolved into the dominant form of combat, where the individual soldier's resilience became the defining characteristic of this theater. Amidst this quagmire of conflict, the very essence of squad cohesion emerged as a crucial element for survival. The breakdown of command structure seen in initial rapid advances was replaced with ad hoc formations driven by mutual support and the experience of shared hardship. These conditions fostered an environment where improvisation dictated operational success. Intimate knowledge of the local landscape became invaluable, as soldiers carved out makeshift networks of connected defenses, turning historic buildings and natural features into fortified positions against the long-term threat posed by the remaining German armor. Meanwhile, the German command faced internal pressures. Dissension began to emerge about the leadership's decision-making. Ironically, the same generals who had championed armored offensives now turned to strategies that reminded them of the trench warfare of World War I. Their tanks required a conventional approach, but were still vulnerable to a tenacious enemy. Discontent within the ranks led to hasty adjustments, notably shifting forces in unpredictable ways to mitigate losses from static defense. Yet these measures often backfired, leading to chaos and the disintegration of previously effective formations. By the end of this relentless cycle of mud and blood, military analysts would dissect the Belgian engagement through the lens of long-lived doctrines. The illusion of an impenetrable edge through mechanization was obscured by the immutable presence of nature. Every piece of equipment immobilized in the mud told its own story, while every soldier trudging through the mire felt the weight of decisions made far from the front lines. The campaign illustrated a critical inflection point in modern warfare where adaptability became an emergent force, a revelation that power was not only derived from advanced mechanization, but from an understanding of the battlefield's ebbs and flows. The Allies had bridged tactical shortfalls through cooperation and rapid learning among disparate units, marking a turning point in their operational philosophy. Historians would later call this period a crucial learning phase in the war. a narrative of defeat against the environment wrapped in the visage of tenacity. Units that initially faltered under the heavy weight of mud would develop doctrines that emphasized the totality of battlefield dynamics, inspiring tactical innovations that engaged every aspect of warfare, from logistics to human resilience. Critical lessons from these engagements would echo in military academies in years to come, reminding generations of the intrinsic ties between man and the landscape. The battlefields of Belgium, with their deep rivulets of water and dirt, would forever serve as a poignant reminder that the war's outcomes are rarely dictated by firepower alone. They are equally shaped by the indomitable forces of nature and the spirit of the individuals within its embrace. As German forces advanced rapidly into Belgium in May 1940, they were wielding the innovative tactics of blitzkrieg, characterized by their speed, surprise, and the combined arms approach, integrating tanks, armored formations, and air support into a cohesive strategy designed to disrupt and dismantle enemy defenses before they could react. However, unbeknownst to the high command gathered in their opulent headquarters, their pursuit of a quick victory was about to confront a most insidious adversary: the grounded muck of the Belgian countryside. As the Wehrmacht thrust forward, the early summer made way for relentless rain, transforming the landscape into an unforgiving quagmire that threatened to undermine their campaigns. Soldiers, well equipped with the latest in mechanized warfare, found themselves entrenched in a war not of their making but dictated by the elements. The mud seeped not only into their vehicles, but also into their plans, disrupting the precision with which they'd executed their military doctrine. The logistics of warfare, particularly in an operation aimed at exploiting speed, hinged on the swift mobility of troops and materials. The German command underestimated how quickly the terrain could turn against them, with a sizable portion of their panzer divisions mired down and incapacitated within the bottomless, waterlogged fields. As tanks became stuck, unable to maneuver effectively or support advancing infantry units, a psychological impact rippled through the ranks. Soldiers witnessed the once mighty engines of war, symbols of the German blitzing might, now motionless and vulnerable. The decision-making tree began to branch into avenues of desperation. Artillery units meant to provide supporting fire risked becoming targets themselves, bogged down and static, leaving infantry to fend off advancing Allied forces without the expected protective firepower. Meanwhile, the Belgian defense was far from an assemblage of disarrayed factions. They were resilient, drawing strength from their knowledge of the local terrain, which now served as both obstacle and ally. As German columns faltered from mechanical woes, the Belgian forces implemented defensive strategies that took full advantage of their intimate familiarity with the landscape. Using the varying degrees of ground saturation to their benefit, they would launch ambushes from concealed positions, striking with precision and retreating before the German forces could muster a counterattack. Their willingness to employ guerrilla tactics played havoc with the German timelines for rapid breakthroughs. The challenge presented by Belgian resistance illustrated a key paradox. The greater the German forces sought to dominate the battlefield, the more vulnerable they became when that domain turned unwieldy. Commanders scrambled to adapt their strategies, ordering units to leverage available anti-tank rifles and artillery pieces to target stalled or isolated German vehicles. As this tactical maneuver gained traction, it illustrated a significant evolution in the understanding of the battlefield. It wasn't solely a clash of technology anymore. Rather, it had morphed into a contest of wits, endurance, and environmental factors that simply refused to yield to mechanized advantage. As days turned into weeks, the toll on human life became increasingly evident amidst the terrible struggle. The mud was relentless, consuming both man and machine in an oppressive grasp. Soldiers clad in soaked uniforms faced the dual threat of enemy fire and the threat of hypothermia exacerbated by relentless rainfall with every passing hour. The muck seeped into their consciousness, creating a shared sense of doom as units faced difficulties in preserving morale amidst the unfolding chaos. Each soldier waded through a psychological mire as well, battling despair and the anguish of witnessing comrades become casualties not just to bullets, but to their environment. The sense of indignity that grew amongst them was palpable. They were physically present on the battlefield, yet mired in obstacles totally predictable by those with a profound grasp of the land's nuances. On the German side, the chain of command began to show cracks as well. Orders sent from distant headquarters failed to encompass the realities faced on the battlefield. The disconnect between commanders, commanding with maps and models, and the soldiers on the front lines grappling with unforgiving conditions, fueled animosity and lack of trust in high command decisions. Whereas earlier tactics emphasized swift attacks leading to encirclements, the slowing tempo of warfare due to the weather forced a re-evaluation of operational doctrines. Instead of blitzing toward victory, they now found themselves bogged down, forced into drawn-out engagements, far from the breakthroughs they so feverishly sought. In the haze of battle, personal stories emerged. Private Hans Müller, a tank operator from Leipzig, found himself for days struggling to free his Panther tank, stuck in the ooze. The cries for help from his comrades reminded him daily of the gravity of their shared predicament. Each time he became aware of the enemy's artillery or infantry, it was often a matter of survival. He could either fight to fend off the onslaught or remain steadfast in the muck and hope for support. Each choice he and his fellow soldiers faced became a microcosm of the larger conflict, one marked by desperation, courage, and a belief that an end to the chaos was possible through sheer persistence. As weeks dragged on, a shift began to crystallize. The German High Command realized that the war in Belgium could not be won through conventional means, given the operational limitations imposed by the terrain. Strategic adjustments were ordered, redirecting attention to artillery barrages aimed at softening Belgian defenses before a renewed ground offensive could be executed. Yet the Allies, utilizing their own lessons learned amid turmoil, began to embrace the fluidity of the battlefield as well. They restructured communication networks, prioritized air support, and sought to provide reinforcements precisely where needed, recognizing that rapid adaptability would mark ascendance on the chaotic fronts. The eventual withdrawal of German forces, marked by strategic regrouping in the face of an unyielding environmental adversary, would coalesce around multiple lessons. Warfare was intrinsically tied to environmental constraints. The human element was crucial, and the dynamics of command needed to evolve regardless of advances in technology. Tacticians and soldiers born from these encounters would go forth with an acute understanding that warfare was less often a calculation of strength versus strength, but more a multidimensional engagement of terrain, momentum, and the unpredictability of the human spirit. The particles of mud, the cries of despair, and the united acts of resistance in the face of a formidable enemy are etched into the legacy of the conflict. All reminders that war and nature are intertwined, and victory often offers a mere illusion, forever influenced by the unpredictable forces of both the land and humanity's resolve. This haunting narrative not only reflects the battles in Belgium, but is mirrored in countless theaters of conflict through history, a potent reminder of how the elements and the individual shape the course of human events and destinies. For those following the stories of courage and chaos forged into the annals of war, remember that every tale of hardship is accompanied by vital lessons learned. Join our community by subscribing and share your suggestions for themes that resonate with you, shedding light on battles that shaped history and the human experience within them. As the German army advanced into Belgium, the seemingly straightforward ambition of a swift conquest was foiled by the unforgiving realities of the terrain. The muddy fields transformed from picturesque agricultural landscapes into treacherous quagmires, impeding the movement of armored divisions and mechanized infantry, a miscalculation that would challenge even the most seasoned commanders. The Germans, keen on reinforcing their blitzkrieg strategy, had anticipated quick maneuvers and rapid advances across the flatlands. However, the element of mud turned their panzer columns into immobilized targets that invited destruction by Allied artillery and air support. This unexpected turn of events compelled the German High Command to reassess their strategies, weighing the impact of natural conditions against tactical innovations that were being employed by the Allies. The initial assault, aimed at leveraging the speed and ferocity of the German forces, quickly devolved into a battle of attrition, where mud, rather than enemy fire, became the primary antagonist. With each passing hour of rainfall, the soil absorbed the weight of their powerful tanks, constraining their movements, blocking supply lines, and hampering communication. In contrast to the streamlined offensives planned by Nazi generals, the muddy Belgian terrain revealed the fundamental vulnerabilities inherent in an industrialized army heavily reliant on mechanization. It soon became apparent that logistical failures induced by the unyielding ground would alter the course of the conflict, compelling German units to rethink not just their tactics, but their very approach to the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Allies, under the growing threat of encirclement yet fully aware of the operational difficulties faced by their adversaries, adopted a strategy of guerrilla warfare and fortification. They maximized the capabilities of their own infantry, deploying light artillery and utilizing the advantageous terrain to dig in and create formidable defensive positions. This became especially telling as units like the British Expeditionary Force and the French Army began to integrate improvised measures, transforming strategic withdrawals into calculated retreats that utilized every ounce of local topography, pockmarked fields, wooded areas, and small villages, to delay and confuse German advances. The logistical challenge for the Allies lay not merely in holding territory, but ensuring their supply lines remained resilient against increasingly desperate German offensives, fortified by knowledge learned from the repercussions of rapid advances. The tightening grip of mud around the German tanks became both a literal and metaphorical representation of their faltering momentum. They were caught in a race against time, with every passing moment eroding their fighting capacity. Increasingly, German commanders had to make choices that pitted the necessity for continued support against the operational realities of their stalled engines. Panzer units, designed for rapid engagement, were now transformed into sitting ducks, vulnerable to Allied artillery that would rain down upon them from camouflaged positions. The fixations on speed and firepower, pivotal tenets of their modern warfare doctrine, faltered under the crushing weight of logistics and terrain. In command centers, the strategic calculus shifted dramatically. Coordination among divisions became imperative. The German Wehrmacht had relied heavily on centralized command structures, efficient yet inflexible. Yet with units spread thin across vast expanses of Belgium and bogged down in hostility, the need arose for decentralized execution of command, allowing local commanders to make split-second decisions reflecting the shifting landscape of battle. Tacticians who attempted to hold steadfast to previous successful frameworks found themselves grappling with conditions that defied their tactical manuals. Capturing ground now hinged less on raw firepower and more on understanding the complexity of the battlefield's nuances. On the ground, soldiers, both German and Allied, experienced the anguish and despair of warfare compounded by environmental hardship. The cold Belgian rains soaked their fatigues. The slick mud pulled at their boots, and visibility was compromised by relentless downpours. With each charge into the fray, the mud that had immobilized armored divisions became the tombs of many soldiers, caught unawares or overwhelmed by the catastrophic conditions of combat. The psychological burden borne by soldiers weighed heavily. They would find themselves not only battling an enemy, but the very landscape around them that quelled their spirits and dampened their resolve. Even in brief respites, the camaraderie developed amidst shared suffering drew soldiers into collective resilience against both physical and emotional exhaustion. As the combat raged, fuel shortages became apparent. Diesel was needed to maneuver armored divisions, yet fuel trucks struggled to deliver supplies, bottlenecked in mud-laden roads. German logistical chains, once heralded for their efficiency, began unraveling under the weight of the environment, a bitter irony for a force that had relied on blitzkrieg principles. On the other side, the Allies faced their own struggles with supply lines as they fortified defenses while managing the influx of necessary provisions. Rations dwindled, and morale became increasingly fragile as the psychological effects of a stalled war weighed heavily on both fronts. Through these tumultuous encounters, humanity, the shared instinct of survival, came into play, revealing the interconnected experience of suffering that transcended nationalistic divides. As the battles unfolded, the ugly reality of war bore down on the soldier's psyche. The visceral imagery of soldiers, caked in mud, clutching their rifles with fatigue-laden grips, spoke of a dull, grinding horror that characterized this theater of World War II. Memory became a haunting echo. The screams of wounded comrades replaced the sounds of artillery, each report reverberating in the minds of the soldiers as they witnessed both valor and vulnerability in those around them. For many, visions of bravery intertwined with crippling fear as the relentless grip of the landscape and the clash of armies coalesced into a singular experience of despair. Compounding this web of horror and humanity was the burgeoning realization that victory was far from a foregone conclusion. For the German High Command, alternative strategies demanded reconsideration. Both ingenuity and brute force remained pivotal, yet insufficient. The very fabric of their operational advantage faded as time ticked down in the war against the stains of mud and chaos. Lessons unfurled anew as combatants from both sides encountered profound realizations about not just the art of warfare, but the essential nature of their shared humanity amid unequivocal tragedy. The battlefield lessons garnered during this unexpected standoff could redefine generations of military doctrine. They illuminate a poignant truth that in the theater of war, both man and nature play a formidable role, forcing commanders and soldiers alike to navigate the tempestuous seas of combat with respect and adaptability, forever impacted by their experiences, seeking not only conquest, but survival amid the chaos of human conflict. The legacies of this engagement would indelibly etch their struggles and triumphs within the annals of history, reshaping the narrative of modern warfare. As the German forces pushed into Belgium during the early phases of their campaign, they anticipated a swift and decisive victory. The Blitzkrieg strategy, characterized by rapid assaults and overwhelming force, was the cornerstone of their operational blueprint. However, they faced unforeseen challenges that would profoundly alter the course of their advance. With tanks and mechanized infantry intended as instruments of rapid exploitation, the mud-soaked terrain of Belgium transformed these powerful machines from dynamic predators into immobilized prey. Rainfall in the region, coupled with the disruptions caused by military operations, rendered roads impassable and left tanks stranded, creating a logistical nightmare that the Wehrmacht had not accounted for. The tactical landscape shifted quickly. The Germans, accustomed to fluid maneuvers, found themselves bogged down in the mud, their armored divisions exposed to the fierce resistance of the Allies. The melange of military strategy employed by the German commanders had relied heavily on speed and surprise. The 100 armored divisions swarmed forward, weaving through the thin lines of Belgian resistance, only to discover nature's unyielding counteroffensive. Each tank that sank into the mud represented a loss of momentum, a ripple effect that compromised their operational tempo. High Command began to realize that their initial assessments were overly optimistic. With communication lines disrupted and supply chains strained under the weight of the terrain, any hope of a swift breakthrough became increasingly derailed. Logistics planners, tasked with ensuring the seamless flow of fuel and ammunition, faced a Herculean task. Rafts of supplies intended for rapid deployment were rendered futile as trucks became immobilized in muck, and as resources dwindled, morale plummeted. Commanders on the ground, steeped in military doctrine suggesting swift victory, were left grappling with the harsh reality that the war would require more than brute force. It demanded patience, innovation, and a re-evaluation of strategies. Responding to these challenges, German commanders attempted to adapt. They deployed specialized units, engineers and recovery teams to pull stranded tanks free, but every attempt to salvage equipment was burdened by the harsh reality of the environment. Their heavy reliance on mechanized units highlighted one of the profound vulnerabilities of the Blitzkrieg strategy. When faced with restrictive terrain, its effectiveness faded. On the contrary, the Allies found themselves growing increasingly aware of the German disarray. They utilized this window of opportunity to regroup and reinforce their defense lines, channeling a collective effort to exploit the Germans' deteriorating logistical situation. As the mud tightened its grip, human suffering compounded alongside tactical blunders. Soldiers encumbered by fatigue and confusion reported feeling the weight of despair, not just from the threat of enemy fire, but from the pervasive sense of being trapped. Shortages of food and medical supplies heightened the fear of starvation and untreated wounds. The mud, relentless and unforgiving, became a symbol of entrapment, reflecting the doom that threatened both sides. In the trenches, medical corpsmen worked tirelessly, their once hopeful ranks dwindling as wounded soldiers flooded in, each falling victim to a war that had become increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Within this tormented theater, individual bravery still surged in acts of defiance. Soldiers, German and Allied alike, pushed beyond their limits. The stories of those who ventured into the muck, either to tend to fallen comrades or to rescue immobilized tanks, underscored a universal narrative of sacrifice that transcended national lines. Their actions formed a stark contrast to the impersonal devastation of mechanized warfare juxtaposed against the rawness of human compassion. Each small victory, in retrieving a fellow soldier, salvaging equipment, or even delivering supplies, was overshadowed by the gnawing realization that tragedy was ever present amidst humanity's attempts at resilience. In this momentous clash, the professional military tacticians found themselves at odds with the unpredictable nature of warfare itself. Reflecting on the toll it demanded, the futility of initial strategies became evident. Commanders began advocating for new approaches, pushing for a blend of armored assaults with infantry support, suggesting that foot soldiers should precede tanks, scouting pathways and determining safe routes through the quagmires of Belgium. Combat engineers proposed a series of roadway improvements to facilitate advanced movement, yet execution of these ideas hinged on resources and time, two commodities dwindling in the face of a grueling conflict. It was amidst this discourse of strategy, error, and human resolve that the confrontation rendered long-lasting conclusions about the essence of warfare. Encounters on the mud-bound battlefields began to shift focus from sheer military might to the rising importance of adaptive tactics and the integration of unit types in combat, instructions that would ripple through future military doctrines. Choices made on the field, driven by immediate necessity rather than doctrine, painted a broader picture of evolving warfare, which demanded acknowledgement of environmental factors and the integral role of human experience amidst technological advancements. As casualty counts mounted amid the clinging mud, the morale of both the German forces and the beleaguered Allies fluctuated, producing an emotional undertone that would linger long after the mud had dried. The shared experiences of hardship cultivated stories of resilience within the ranks, yet the scars of loss ran deep. Each soldier bore the weight of not only combat losses, but also the lonely specter of isolation. The realization that the enemy was not solely on the opposite side of the front line, but also intertwined with nature itself, as both were active participants in a tragic drama of existence. The legacy left by these formidable battles in Belgium would ripple across timelines and inform generations. As the echoes of artillery and the cries of the wounded faded, the memory of human endurance against the elements and the unpredictability of warfare remained vividly alive. In the ensuing months, every strategist and commander would revisit these battles, not just for their tactical lessons, but as a profound testament to the complexities of warfare, where humanity, technology, and nature collided in a haunting ballet of conflict. The memory of mud, irrevocably staining the fabric of military history, would stand as both a reminder of humanity's fragility and the unyielding spirit born from adversity. As the autumn months deepened in 1944, the topography of the Belgian landscape presented a treacherous stage for warfare, transforming into a quagmire that defied even the most meticulously planned military strategies. The German forces, bolstered by a reputation for swift armored advances, were soon to discover that their tanks, the pride of their blitzkrieg tactics, were rendered immobile by the relentless precipitation that turned fields into marshes. The supposed superiority of mechanized warfare was put to the ultimate test, revealing the critical interplay between technology and the elemental forces of nature that no military manual could fully anticipate. Commanders, such as General Erich von Manstein, faced an existential dilemma: how to maintain momentum against an unyielding foe while grappling with the constraints imposed by the very earth on which they fought. Intended to capitalize on surprise and mobility, Operation Market Garden was envisioned as a bold, decisive maneuver aimed at outflanking the Allied forces. However, the realities of the battlefield were starkly dissonant with the high-minded aspirations of military objectives. As the weather worsened, combining torrential rains with the impending winter chill, the solid ground that once provided a foundation for rapid troop movements became a treacherous liability. German tanks, designed for speed and firepower, bogged down in the mud, betraying the very essence of their purpose. Infantry units, supported by their armored counterparts, became increasingly reliant on foot travel, navigating paths that were treacherous at best and nearly impassable at worst. With the infantry's progress considerably hampered, their vulnerability to counterattacks increased. Faced with this precarious situation, German planners sought to adapt their tactics in real time. The initial reliance on mechanized flanking maneuvers was replaced by a renewed emphasis on anti-tank and artillery units, which adapted to the muddy conditions to provide indirect fire support. Panzer divisions were encumbered by the wetlands. Thus, commanders opted for fortified strategic positions to leverage artillery against attacking Allied forces. Yet, these positions required meticulous planning and adaptation, as commanders faced the omnipresent threat of counter-battery fire from Allied artillery units that were all too aware of the German vulnerability. While the German command grappled with the realization that their mechanized blitz had slowed to a crawl, the Allies, with their own set of challenges, prepared to exploit the situation. American forces, bolstered by the lessons learned from the fierce fighting in Normandy, were also keenly aware that adapting to the changing battlefield was critical. The muddy terrain posed an equally formidable adversary, necessitating a careful approach to troop deployments. Air support, which had previously proven invaluable, became less reliable due to the overcast conditions, limiting visibility for aerial operations. Yet, they did not falter. Rather, they embraced an opportunity where many considered it only a liability. Support from specialized units, like engineers who typically focused on logistics, was repurposed to create makeshift paths and crossings that would allow for the movement of troops and supplies, vital for maintaining the momentum of their counteroffensive strategy. The juxtaposition of human resolve against technological constraint highlighted the intricate dance of warfare. Soldiers on both sides were confronted with harsh realities. To advance was paramount, but so were their own survival and the overarching command directives. A notable incident unfolded when a squad of American infantrymen surveyed the wasteland of their battlefield and spotted a lone German tank caught in the muck, desperately trying to extricate itself. Instead of engaging immediately, the squad took a calculated risk, waiting to establish a better tactical position before mobilizing support. This moment became emblematic of the individual decisions made in isolation, which cumulatively determined the larger outcome of the conflict. The struggle became less about direct confrontations and more about who could adapt and endure the rigors of the environment, where cunning trumped firepower. As engagements burgeoned under these dire conditions, the emotional toll on both sides mounted. The experiences of the soldiers became interwoven narratives of courage, fear, and the constant omnipresence of death. Disconnected from their homes and loved ones, soldiers faced the uncertainty of whether they would see another day. The psychological burdens became as debilitating as any physical injury sustained in combat. In juxtaposition to the striking imagery of soldiers forging through mud and rain, stories of camaraderie and resilience surfaced. A shared moment of laughter, however brief, amidst the chaos could provide a fleeting escape from the relentless barrage of artillery and the strains of an unyielding environment. The consequences of prolonged engagement began to manifest more profoundly. Higher command faced intensifying pressure from their respective governments and military institutions for quick victories, but both sides lost sight of the significance of attrition warfare. These battles were not to be measured merely by ground gained or lost, but by the harrowing costs, the fortitude of humanity against the grinding gears of a war machine that was losing its lubricity in the muck. As weeks of fighting stretched into months, the human element became inextricably linked to the environment, forming a narrative of survival that transcended the chalked battle lines of commanders' maps. Ultimately, the entire saga of warfare in Belgium underscored the adaptability of military doctrine. Learning from the mud-stained lessons of resilience against not only the enemy, but the land itself birthed a new perception of battlefield logistics that would guide future operations for decades to come. By the war's conclusion, the histories laid out tales of valor and vulnerability, where both triumph and tragedy entwined, mediated by forces beyond any single soldier's control. The alleys of mud and chaos bore witness to the evolution of military thought, illuminating with profound clarity that as much as technology advances, the human experience remains the defining factor on the battlefield. The hard-won lessons from the muddy battlegrounds became woven into the intellectual fabric of military strategy. What emerged was a recognition that warfare was as much about the unrelenting nature of the world as it was about tactics and technology. It would lay the groundwork for a new understanding of conflict, one in which humans would remain central, not just as soldiers, but as navigators of circumstance steeped in the uncertainties of weather, morale, and the call of duty. The mud would dry, but its influence would reverberate through the corridors of military teaching, shaping the art of war for generations yet to come, ensuring that the narratives of resilience would never be forgotten amidst the strategies of conquest. Block 09. As the conflict in Belgium unfolded, the environment continued to shape the narrative of the conflict as profoundly as opposing forces did. The German Wehrmacht had anticipated a rapid victory with their renowned blitzkrieg tactics, relying heavily on mechanized infantry, motorized artillery, and tank divisions that had overwhelmed adversaries across Europe. However, as their panzers plowed into the Belgian landscape in May 1940, they were met not only with resistance from Belgian forces and their allies, but also with a natural terrain that would stoutly oppose their advances. The mud, resulting from incessant rains, encapsulated the machinery in a grip of earth that left many tanks immobile and vulnerable, turning supposed invincibility into liability. The muddy fields of the Ardennes hampered the movement of these armored columns, resulting in cumbersome progress. Where speed and surprise should have been allies, they became casualties of a landscape unyielding to combat maneuvers. The German commanders quickly realized that their tactical flexibility, their ability to rapidly reposition their forces, was impeded by the excessive waterlogged conditions. The previously dominant battle tanks like the Panzer III and I-4, which were designed for speed and lethal assaults, found themselves bogged down, with mechanically overburdened engines working overtime to churn through viscous earth. Strategic planning that had focused on mobility suddenly collapsed under the reality of being stuck in the mire amongst the enemy's fire. Vulnerable and unable to retreat effectively, there were instances where German armor became easy prey for Belgian anti-tank units, specifically the Belgian 75mm PaK 40 guns that had been expertly deployed to cover lanes of approach. Faced with these stark realities, the German High Command adjusted its approach. The need for logistics and support units proved critical. Tank recoveries and repairs became paramount. Engineers were dispatched to clear mud-clogged roads and to improve the mobility of supply lines. Yet, for every unit that was prioritized to aid recovery, more resources were inevitably drained from the front lines, leading to tactical shortages. As the Wehrmacht adapted, they deployed detailed reconnaissance and employed the use of aircraft in ground support to both coordinate assaults and target enemy installations, hoping to gain any advantage they could amidst the sluggish progress. However, the relationship between ground and air forces wasn't always seamless. Communication between them faltered as incorrect coordinates led to cases of friendly fire, emphasizing the chaotic nature of warfare amidst adverse environmental conditions. Yet, as the Germans struggled, The Belgian resistance took advantage of these setbacks, employing guerrilla tactics and local knowledge to their benefit. Small units of soldiers operated with the element of surprise, utilizing the knowledge of local terrain to ambush the lumbering German supply columns transporting fuel and ammunition. However, these tactics too were marked by heavy losses. The human toll began to manifest painfully, as Belgium faced a tug-of-war between sustaining resistance and suffering under the mechanized might of their occupiers. Civilians caught in this fray endured their share of suffering. Homes were lost, families shattered, and communities torn apart as the war machine rumbled unheeded through villages long untouched by such brutality. The psychological strain on all sides was exacerbated by the landscapes of war, with every trench, every inch of mud, and sorrowful cries echoing the reality of being encased within a deadly cycle of attrition. The muddy battlegrounds became a stark reminder of the fragility of both mechanical superiority and human spirit. Soldiers on both sides reported feelings of despair. German soldiers, once brimming with confidence led by the charismatically aggressive strategies of their officers, now faced the creeping sense of uncertainty as their rapid maneuverability turned slow and excruciating. For Allied troops, the determination to hold the line clashed with their own inner turmoil, with morale fluctuation heavily influenced by the dreariness of their surroundings, mixed with the ever-present threat of annihilation. The culmination of these struggles became evident during the Battle of Hanot, a critical engagement that would come to symbolize both the potential and limitations of mechanized warfare when entangled with nature's grip. The German forces, despite operating with advanced technology, found themselves engaged in an arduous battle against Belgian and British defenders. The Belgian forces, notably the armored units, exhibited both tenacity and tactical ingenuity. Relying on their intimate knowledge of the terrain, they established ambush points within the narrow confines of the flooded lowlands, creating choke points for the advancing tanks. The use of anti-tank artillery and well-placed infantry allowed a contained defense, ultimately slowing the German advance more than anticipated. Despite initial successes, however, German tactical superiority began to exert itself over time, and the limitations of the Allied forces became clearer. Insufficient reinforcements and communication silos plagued their capability to mount a credible counteroffensive, as units remained doggedly entrenched in a war of attrition. As days turned into relentless struggles against mud and morale, command decisions became increasingly vital in balancing the sustaining of operations with the brutality of losses suffered. The propensity for German forces to adapt their strategy, channeling overwhelming numbers into key positional gains, began to manifest, carving through Allied defenses, but always the slowness of the battlefield and the consequences of weather loomed large. The implications of the mud on the military strategies employed during this conflict reverberated past the immediate operational nuances of the Belgian front. Analysts and military theorists from both sides began to scrutinize these events, drawing lessons that would redefine future engagements. The impact of weather on troop deployment and the role of logistics in sustainable combat operations became clear. They stipulated the importance of a comprehensive understanding of terrain, which would inform not just tactics, but also the very design of future military equipment tailored to withstand harsh environmental conditions. As for the beleaguered Belgian populace, theirs was a narrative woven within the larger tapestry of global conflict, the pain of losing their homeland while heroically working to protect it. Their struggles, sacrifices, and unyielding resolve amid adversity showcased the often unseen elements of war, the humanity striving against the odds, scenery torn between beauty and devastation. The mud might have clothed their land in darkness, but from it emerged stories of courage and resistance that would be etchings of history, defining not just the Belgian resistance, but the spirit of warfare itself. The muddy fields became not just a physical battleground but also a crucible for human struggles, marked by the paradox of destruction and resilience, persistence and surrender, where the thick, viscous mud mirrored the complexities of human lives caught in the tumult of war. As the German forces advanced into Belgium during the late spring of 1940, They had anticipated a swift victory. The blitzkrieg strategy relied not only on speed and surprise, but also on the seamless integration of combined arms, namely, fast-moving armored divisions supported by air and infantry operations. However, the uninhibited aspirations of the Wehrmacht swiftly collided with the grim realities of the battlefield. The mud, a vital participant in the war, transformed the idyllic rolling hills and verdant fields into treacherous muck that ensnared vehicles and chilled the spirits of men. These armored giants, magnificent in their power, turned into sitting ducks, their tracks filled with the viscous earth that stymied mobility. As the mechanized warfare strategies crumbled, a cacophony of technical failures and human endurance unfolded, revealing a narrative painted in strokes of valor and desperation. While high-ranking German commanders meticulously plotted their strategies on detailed maps, the disappointing outcome of poorly timed offensives became evident when their armored columns got mired in mud. Panzer divisions, originally designed for swift encirclements and rapid penetrations behind enemy lines, were rendered vulnerable by the boggy terrain. The tanks that rolled through the lush landscapes of Germany found themselves floundering in the soft underfoot, wrought by Belgium's recent rains. Logistics, often regarded as the backbone of military operations, came to the forefront. Fuel supplies became limited, and the inflexibility of the terrain led to panic. Stories began circulating among the troops of abandoned vehicles, their crews forced to march on foot, exposed and vulnerable. A once proud symbol of Nazi German might dwindle to a series of halted offensives and frustrating standstill. Compounding these challenges was the omnipresent air travel of the Luftwaffe. Expecting their planes to provide air superiority to assist ground troops, German leaders presumed that air bombardments would decimate any defensive positions thrown up by Allied forces. However, the rain-soaked weather turned their strategic aerial plans on their head as low visibility rendered bombing sorties nearly useless. Moreover, the Allied forces, although increasingly overwhelmed, sought refuge in huts and forests, fortifying positions where they could resist the onslaught of mechanized warfare, calling upon the land's redeeming features to bolster defenses. The mud that appeared to benefit the attackers was now an equalizer, slowing their drive and offering beleaguered defenders a faint glimmer of hope amid prevailing despair. Decisions made in the makeshift command centers were crucial. Allied leaders, realizing that their traditional defensive postures had to be amended, began to implement an approach focused on attrition and delay rather than outright confrontation. The goals shifted not towards the elimination of enemy forces, but to prolong engagements through strategic withdrawals, conserving troops, and making advantageous use of the environment. As the muddy terrain claimed equipment and disoriented encroachments, ingenuity among the lower ranks surfaced. Squads of Belgian soldiers and various Allied units devised makeshift fortifications using mud, saplings, and other available materials to create choke points where they could lure German forces into ambushes. The love of the land coalesced with fight-or-flight instincts, manifesting in a hard-fought resistance where every inch of earth became a focal point of sacrifice. In this theater defined by mud and miscalculation, the human element became paramount. Soldiers on both sides faced the agony of waiting, huddled within the confines of hastily dug trenches, the bitter sting of cold seeping into every bone. The stench of earth saturated by rain mingled with sweat, creating a dismal atmosphere that spoke volumes of the hardships endured. From the muddy banks of the River Dyle to the once peaceful villages reduced to rubble, suffering intertwined the lives of comrades and enemies alike. As the German forces found their operations transitioning from expectations to grit and blood, they faced an unfamiliar foe, not merely armed resistance, but the metal of human spirit anchored in despair. While high command calculated logistics in sterile offices far removed from the front lines, the true nature of war unfolded in the hearts and minds of soldiers. The stories of those who displayed extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds began to filter down through the ranks. The Belgians, fighting against not only an occupying power but for their homes, manifested an unexpected fortitude. Each ambush successfully executed against encroaching tanks became a clarion call, galvanizing a deeper resolve amongst troops and civilians alike. As the mud impeded the Germans, it inadvertently engendered a unique synergy among the beleaguered defenders, reinforcing their commitment to resist the advance of tyranny. Casualties were mounting, and a palpable sense of uncertainty loomed as both armies began to adapt to the gripping constraints of the environment. Even those tasked with assigning blame struggled to conceal their trepidation. Tactical decisions became fraught with the awareness of mud's unpredictability and the human cost of continued confrontation. Stories emerged of soldiers sharing rations, of breaches of enemy lines questioned by slight murmurs of mutual understanding, trying to foster connections amidst hostility. In the chaos of conflicting orders and crumbling morale, empathy occasionally glimmered through the haze of combat, emphasizing that even in war's vicious ballet, humanity seeks refuge in camaraderie and shared suffering. As the engagements wore on and both sides re-evaluated tactics amidst fluctuating fortunes, the mud represented a common adversary, transcending territorial disputes. Characterized by its merciless grip, the earth became an insidious player in the war, neither explicitly allied with defender nor aggressor. With every inch gained, every soldier sunk into the muck, the realization dawned that the conditions of battle demanded a complete reassessment of how campaigns are waged. It hinted towards the blurring lines of victory and defeat as the conflict continued, underscoring the need to adapt not just plans or maneuvers, but the very fabric of military philosophy in light of understanding the environmental adversities that shape warfare. The tensions of this muddy battlefield, pierced by the cries of soldiers and the heavy treads of armored machines now bogged down, bore witness to a crucial juncture in military history. The chaotic fury of war juxtaposed against the claims of mud invoked an existential reflection, quickening a contemporary reconsideration of strategic foresight. What began as an anticipated rout evolved into a testament of endurance, emphasizing humanity's relentless pivot towards resistance, revealing that the mud, once deemed a mere nuisance, became a pivotal player in shaping the destiny of lives caught on these brutal fields. The realities on the ground would refine not just the tactics of the present conflict, but would forever influence the design of future warfare, altering the trajectory and expectations of militaries worldwide.